The cafe door chimed, and the room kept breathing like nothing remarkable had happened. But warmth stepped in, wearing ordinary clothes and carrying the kind of quiet that makes a heartbeat listen. Steam curled up from cups, spoons chimed against porcelain, a guitar murmured from the speakers, and then it happened. 2 lines of sight collided across the distance, and the map of loneliness redrew itself in a single glance. No rehearsed smile, no cinematic entrance, just the honest shock of being seen. Fingers that had learned to curl into small fists loosened around a cup. Shoulders that had memorized the weight of caution remembered how to settle. The gaze held, steady, kind, a curious question without words, until the world dissolved into that shared focus where strangers stop being strangers and something ancient wakes up. Every room keeps its own weather, and that afternoon the cafe's weather shifted from overcast to early spring. Not because the noise faded, but because the silence between 2 people found a name. Eyes traced the rim of a mug to keep from staring and failed anyway, drawn back as if tethered by a thread nobody else could see. This wasn't fireworks or fanfare. This was a candle lit in a window after a long road in the dark. The room moved, barista calling out orders, sugar packets tearing, laughter lifting like birds. And yet a stillness spread inside skin, a stillness that said, "Pay attention." Recognition doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives, sits down at the table, and stretches out its legs like it lives here. The first breath after that recognition tasted different, like air washed clean by rain. That heart, once careful to look away too quickly, chose to hold the gaze 1 heartbeat longer. 1 heartbeat, then 2, then enough to memorize the way light fell on that face. 1,000 small details became luminous. The way a sleeve pushed up the forearm, the slight tilt of a head while listening to the barista, the grateful smile when the cup was passed across the counter. None of it remarkable in any other life, all of it extraordinary in this moment. The table held a notebook, a pen, a phone face down as if the world could wait. Pages had held so many words, brave and brittle and necessary, and now those words felt like stepping stones to a bridge that had finally come into view. No sudden plan, no script, just a soft decision rising like steam. Stay. Stay and let the moment widen. Stay and let the heart risk a little light. Feet moved before the mind did, a choreography learned in another lifetime. The space between tables narrowed, and the closer the steps came, the clearer everything felt. Awe kept company with caution. Hope and fear braided their fingers, pulled tight, and yet the body knew what it was doing. Greeting formed in the mouth before the mouth formed the greeting. Voice, steadier than expected, crossed the last inches that sight could not. Hello can sound like a door unlocking. Hello can sound like a candle catching. The reply landed warm and easy, voice low, eyes bright with the same surprise. Conversation began where conversation sometimes ends, with honesty. Nothing forced. Favorite books, the way rain sounds on old roofs, the kind of music saved for late nights, the superstition of making a wish when the clock hits the day and month of a birthday. Little things opened into vast things. Laughter found its true pitch, unpracticed, reedy at first, then full and round. The barista wiped a circle on the counter and glanced over with the half-smile people wear when they witness a beginning. 2 cups steamed, 2 chairs leaned in, and time rearranged its furniture. Loneliness had always felt like being underwater, hearing the world above but never breaking the surface. This felt like lungs remembering they were made for air. Suspicion had once sworn to protect. Now it stepped back a pace to give tenderness some room. The conversation turned soft around the edges, the way light goes honey-colored before evening. Hands spoke their own language, one resting on the table, the other tracing the lip of a cup, both learning the new gravity that pulled them closer. Names were exchanged like secrets entrusted to a safe place. Stories followed, gentle ones first, then braver ones, careful not to flood each other with more than the present could carry. The room continued its ordinary miracle, orders, footsteps, the clinking waltz of ceramic, and yet the table existed in a pocket of time where 2 people can build a home out of listening. The spark didn't show off. It didn't demand. It simply warmed everything it touched, drying the damp edges of old disappointments, laying a small, steady heat against the ribs. Words drifted into silences that weren't empty but full of consent to breathe. Eyes found eyes without flinching. A small smile became a soft anchor. Somewhere inside, a carefulness long mistaken for prudence released its grip. Recognition turned into relief. Relief turned into curiosity. Curiosity turned into the boldness to ask a question that mattered. Stay a little longer? The answer arrived as a nod that felt like sunlight. The cup went empty, then full again. A delicate rhythm formed. Talk, listen, sip, smile. Like waves unspooling on a forgiving shore. Stories found echoes. A shared love for bookstores that smell like dust and ink. For movies that end without tying every thread. For walking just to feel the city's pulse. The ordinary alignment of preferences felt like conspiracy. The extraordinary alignment of presence felt like grace. Sometimes love announces itself by absence. The absence of noise in the mind, the absence of urgency, the absence of the need to perform. The face across the table didn't require a better version of a self. It invited the truest one. Shoulders dropped another inch. Breath traveled more easily. Even the past felt less like a tangled forest and more like a path that knew where it had been leading. Outside, clouds stacked and drifted. People hurried by with umbrellas and errands and unspoken prayers. Inside, the air gathered itself into a promise. Not forever, not yet, but for now, and now again, and the next now after that. The kind of promise that doesn't live in words as much as in the way a gaze doesn't wander when the door opens, the way a laugh arrives from the chest rather than the throat, the way a hand rests on wood as if waiting for another hand to find it. When fingers finally touched, everything familiar felt new and everything new felt familiar. It wasn't a dramatic clasp. It was a question asked palm to palm, answered by warmth traveling skin to skin. That single touch delivered a message more fluent than any speech. You're not alone in this room, in this life, in this moment. The body listened with attention reserved for good music. The heart stepped forward like a guest called to the front row. The past did not vanish. It simply moved to a seat where it could observe without deciding the ending. A softness set in, as though the evening were already inside the afternoon, as though the light inside the cafe were learning to glow like bedside lamps in kitchen windows and other places where safety lives. That's how healing begins. Not as a thunderclap, but as a door left ajar, a breeze moving through a once stale house. The conversation folded into pauses that allowed the pulse to be heard. Any fear that remained arrived as a helpful friend. Measure this, it said. Be careful with what matters. But care can coexist with courage, and courage showed up as a simple sentence. Another cup? Another hour? Another chapter? The answer again was yes. Names were said like blessings. Plans were made that didn't pretend to be destiny. A walk after dusk, a new cafe next week, a book recommended and promised. Even the way the check was shared felt like a rehearsal for gentleness. In the reflection of the window, two silhouettes leaned close, framed by evening. Outside, the day lowered its voice. Inside, a future raised its hand. Hearts rarely send a calendar invite for the moment everything tilts. They simply tilt. And in that tilt, the world reveals how much kindness it has been waiting to give. This was the moment. Not a dramatic vow, not a staged confession, only a gaze holding steady, a hand answering a hand, a quiet that made room for two. The spark didn't explode. It endured. Endurance is how a night will later become more than a night, how a touch will shift from discovery to devotion, how morning will arrive with the hum of presence and the promise of coffee shared and laughter echoing, how safety will grow roots and carry tenderness without dropping it. But for now, it remained exactly what it needed to be, a beginning that knew itself. Some stories start with grand gestures. This one started when two people in an ordinary room decided to let hope sit down. And sometimes that is more than enough. The first sign that healing had begun was small enough to miss. Shoulders remembering how to drop the last inch. Breath finding its way past the sternum without catching on old barbs. The way a room felt wider when fear loosened its grip. The day had been ordinary in every visible way. Street noise layered with wind, Keys dropped in a bowl by the door, the soft thud of shoes left in the hallway. But something quiet waited in the air, patient as a hand extended but not insisting. A couch held space like a harbor after long water. Light filtered through the curtains in long, kind stripes. On the table, a half-drunk glass of water sweated a ring onto a coaster, the kind of domestic halo that appears when time slows down enough to witness it. Quiet didn't mean emptiness. It meant possibility. The body, a careful archivist of every flinch and every farewell, kept the records close. Memories could still lift their sharp edges at the strangest moments. An innocent song turned into a summons, a scent releasing a trap door, a sudden laugh elsewhere that sounded like a door closing here. Wounds have their own calendars, and this one had circled today without telling anyone. But there was also warmth in the room, steadfast, steady-eyed warmth, carrying no demand to move faster or braver than truth would allow. The first touch came like weather easing, not a bolt, not a wave, just a front moving through, gentle but certain. Fingers hovered, asked without asking, and waited for permission so carefully that permission arrived as a sigh rather than a word. Skin met skin and the archives rustled. A thumb traced a small circle on the back of a hand, the kind of motion that says stay, that says no rush, that says there will be as many breaths as needed. That single circle, slow and deliberate, felt like a lighthouse turning. With each rotation, the room brightened by degrees. The heart, long trained to brace, did what it always does at first, measured. Is this safe? Is this soft? Does this touch know how to listen? Listening hands are rare. These did not rush to solve or to take. They learned the terrain like students of a sacred map. Wrist to wrist, pulse to pulse, the conversation deepened. The body has 1,000 doors. Some squeak, some are swollen from weather, some have never been opened without storming. This touch brought oil and patience. The vault of the ribs unlocked one hinge at a time. The breath came easier still. Trust, which had been keeping vigil behind the curtains, stepped closer to the window. The second touch belonged to hair tucked behind an ear, then held there, not to claim, but to comfort. The gesture felt like placing a bookmark in the middle of a life and saying, "This is where we paused, but we will return." Fingers threaded together and settled on a lap, anchoring the moment with enough weight to prove it existed, light enough to lift if needed. The body read the message exactly as intended. You choose the pace. This hand will match it. The mind, a constant storyteller, slowed its spinning to hear a quieter plotline. Old scenes tried to reassert themselves. Raised voices. Doors slammed a heartbeat too hard. The raw aftertaste of apologies that never learned how to change. But presence has a way of shrinking shadows. Not erasing them, not pretending they never sprawled across the floor, simply lighting them until they remembered their proper size. A palm cupped a cheek, and the cheek leaned into the cup. A forehead rested against another forehead. A small bridge where 1,000 words walked back and forth, and none of them had to be spoken. The body answered with warmth where it once answered with retreat. The heart rewarded the experiment with a new rhythm, slower, fuller, unafraid to be heard. Eyes closed, not to escape but to enter. Scent, breath, heartbeat, the near-silent prayer of skin saying yes. Time stretched thin until it stopped trying to be linear and just held still for 2. Touch moved like handwriting across a page that had been crumpled and smoothed out again, tender with the memory of creases but strong enough to carry new ink. Shoulders learned a new language under those hands. Down, open, stay. The throat, once tight with unshed sentences, felt the knot loosen. Words warmed themselves near the fire in case they were needed, then sat back down because silence was doing the speaking better. Silence can be unkind. This one wasn't. It held the shape of 2 breathing beings and protected it from the clatter outside. Familiar fragility, always scanning for the first sign of withdrawal, was met by a gaze that didn't flicker. The gaze said, "Still here." The hand said, "Still here." The body, unconvinced by anything less than evidence, counted again. "Still here," a smile rose, surprised by how unafraid it felt to appear. The next movement was simple, fingers mapping the length of an arm, from wrist to elbow to shoulder, as if reacquainting 2 parts of the same person with each other. Along the route, a few old alarms tested their volume. What if softness leads to falling? What if falling means breaking? What if breaking this time is the end? The answer didn't arrive as logic. It arrived as contact. Gentle pressure where the muscle tightened, then a release when that pressure taught the muscle that relaxing was allowed. Touch following breath, breath following touch, both following trust. The power of being held is not in restraint but in permission. A careful pull into an embrace, the kind that doesn't close a door but opens the walls so that the room inside a chest can be larger than fear remembers. The chin found a shoulder. The shoulder held. The hands moved up and down the back with a steady rhythm, like waves remembering how to be sure. The smell of fabric softened by daylight and detergent, the warmth of cotton warmed by skin, the simple holiness of being close enough to hear another person's inhale and exhale. This is the liturgy the body understands best. Tears came, good ones, bearing salt that didn't sting but cleansed. A thumb cleared them as they traveled, neither shushing nor spotlighting, just acknowledging the ceremony of their passage. The face that had learned how to be a mask returned to being a face. The hands traced the hairline, the temple, the jaw, and finally rested, with reverence, over the sternum, where so many nights had pressed and pressed as if trying to break out. The gesture said, "There is nothing here that needs to be exiled." The gesture said, "Everything that happened belongs to the story, but not to the steering wheel." The heartbeat under that hand proved what the mind had been too tired to argue. Alive, still, and worthy. Later, on that same couch that had watched the whole scene, touch grew bolder only in honesty. There are ways to be close that don't perform closeness but inhabit it. Hands learned how to ask before they moved, learned how to receive as well as give, learned how to listen for the difference between hesitation and hunger. Mouths met like messengers who had been running a long time just to deliver one sentence: safe. The body, once certain that desire meant danger, discovered a new equation where desire partnered with tenderness, and neither had to apologize for wanting the other present. When laughter arrived mid-kiss, nobody tried to silence it. It was proof of oxygen. When stillness followed, nobody rushed it. It was proof of understanding. Hours folded themselves into a small, particular eternity. No grand declarations, no contracts drafted in the heat of a moment. Just the daily miracle of someone staying where staying was promised. The lights dimmed not because evening demanded it, but because gentleness looks beautiful when everything else quiets down. In that dim, hands explored with the reverence of travelers entering a long-closed sanctuary, not to conquer, not to catalog, but to wonder. Each discovery was really a remembering. Bodies are made to hold and be held. Nerves are made to sing. Scars are not shame but testimony. Where the ribcage once housed only thunder, it now hosted music. Where the jaw once locked, it unlocked and released 3 deep breaths in a row, each one a seed of future ease. The past tried one last time to interrupt, old film reels clicking on with gray images of doors slammed, words weaponized, a bed that felt like a battlefield. But the projector ran out of electricity. Presence had unplugged it. What replaced the reels was softer and stronger. A vision of mornings where hands make coffee and touch the small of a back in passing. Afternoons of text messages that don't demand but delight. Nights where bodies meet not as relief from loneliness but as celebration of connection. Healing doesn't erase history. It reduces its dictation from law to footnote. In the hours that followed, warmth found all the places that winter had kept and settled in like a resident with a long lease. The window showed a city unaware of the tiny revolution in this room. A clock insisted on being practical. The heart, less interested in practicality, kept marveling. Before sleep, there was one more touch, the kind that tucks a blanket, smooths a stray curl, kisses a temple with a promise that doesn't overpromise. The promise of tomorrow, of returning, of choosing again. The body stored that promise in a place where panic used to live. When morning opened its eyes, the wild thing inside the ribs did not bolt. It purred. Pain hadn't disappeared. It had shrunk beside presence until it could be held in one hand without spilling. And that is how love answers a broken heart, by laying a steady palm over it and staying. The door clicked shut, and the apartment caught its breath as if the whole place understood the difference between company and presence, between passing time and arriving fully. Shoes found their corner. A jacket met the back of a chair, and the evening exhaled. Lamps dimmed to the kind of light that forgives. Music settled at a low murmur, and the world outside shrank to soft weather on glass. Desire didn't announce itself with a drumbeat. It threaded the quiet the way a hand threads another. Careful, curious, deliberate. There was no rush to the couch, no script that required a cue, just the slow discovery that two people can stand in the same room and notice the same hush expanding between them. Breath found a slower pace, shoulders unlearned their armor, and the smallest distance, the one between reaching and being received, began to close. Hands spoke first, unassuming diplomats of truth. Knuckles brushed, then stayed. Fingertips traveled the length of a forearm as if reading a history written in invisible ink. A palm settled at the small of a back with a promise not of conquest but of care. Lips followed not to claim but to confirm, meeting with the tenderness of a secret shared in confidence. The kiss was steady rather than urgent, honest rather than clever. It listened as much as it asked. Silence around it was not empty but full of permission, to pause, to breathe, to check that the heart felt safe in its opening. The first night wasn't a performance measured by crescendos. It was a conversation measured by yes. That yes appeared in the way eyes didn't dart away when closeness grew, in the way a hand paused at a shoulder and waited for the warmth underneath to welcome it, in the way the room's light seemed to lean in and bless the scene. Trust didn't arrive as a banner. It crept in like dawn, testing the edges of darkness and then replacing them with something clearer. Each small decision joined the next like stones across water. Move closer, slow down, laugh when nerves do their little dance, rest the forehead against a forehead and feel two temperatures agree to share heat. Clothing became less about modesty and more about truth, fabric sliding away because honesty asked for skin, and skin answered with an unafraid yes. The body didn't hurry. It listened. It listened to breath, to pulse, to the bright silence that appears when a room holds nothing but kindness. A shoulder was kissed like a question, a collarbone like a page turned softly, a wrist like an oath. The room's map redrew itself. Couch as coastline, rug as meadow, bed as field of first snow where footprints can be followed later and marveled at. Were we really that brave? That gentle? That willing to step exactly where care wanted to go? There were moments of stillness that said more than any movement could. Lying side by side, fingers counting ribs as if inventorying a house that has finally decided to be home. Eyes tracing a jawline that's more familiar than any skyline. A pulse under a thumb that answered without flinching. Some nights collapse under the weight of old ghosts, but this one welcomed them, set out chairs, and showed them what it means to witness without ruling. Past wounds tried to speak in their old loud voices, "Don't trust this, don't open that, don't forget what happened before." But tenderness outlasted them. Tenderness has the stamina of truth. It keeps showing up again and again until fear concedes that honesty intends to stay. The body gathered proofs the mind could not argue with. How a name sounds when spoken against a neck in gratitude rather than need. How laughter refuses to hide even when desire is present, because joy and longing are cousins who celebrate at the same table. How every yes becomes a bridge to the next yes, until the span grows strong enough to carry two people across troubled water. When uncertainty fluttered, the answer was always presence. A hand squeezed once. A gaze returned undistracted. A whisper. Just enough air to carry the shape of a vow without promising what life hasn't offered yet. Reminded the night that intimacy is something given, not taken. Faces learned a new geography, temple to cheek to chin, the way breath warms skin before lips touch, the way a kiss can be both arrival and homecoming. Bodies learned new rituals, pausing to listen for the smallest recoil, and then easing, offering warmth where the past remembers cold, asking with a touch and waiting for the answer to rise from the skin rather than the head. There was nothing cinematic about the way the sheets moved, and yet the scene pressed itself into memory with ink that will not wash out. The weight of a knee on a mattress, the squeak of springs punctuating laughter, the hush that followed when hearts synchronized. Time misbehaved in the best way, stretching so a minute could hold a handful of eternities, then sprinting so an hour could vanish into a glow that would warm the days to come. Desire, humming between breaths, tuned every sense to honesty, the citrus on a wrist from earlier in the evening, the bite of winter air that had followed through the door now softened into skin warmth, the aftertaste of tea on a tongue that had learned to move with care instead of hurry. Every touch said something that words could only echo. Here, here, here. Trust answered, still here. There was a moment, quiet and unmistakable, when the mind stopped bargaining and the body, relieved, entered fully. Not as surrender to another person's will, but as surrender to the truth already present. Two lives daring to be seen without armor. In that moment, passion and understanding were no longer opposites negotiating a truce. They were partners building a language. Bodies found a rhythm free of performance, sometimes slow as prayer, sometimes playful as a secret joke, always anchored in the certainty that nothing was owed and everything offered had been freely given. The bed held. The night deepened. Moonlight braided with lamplight on forearms and shoulders, drawing pale roads that led everywhere and nowhere, because the destination wasn't a place, it was a state of being met. There were breaks for water that felt like gratitude, breaks for story that felt like weaving, breaks for quiet that felt like faith. At one point, a nose brushed a nose and both faces broke into grins too unguarded to be anything but truth. At another, a hand traveled the slow path down a spine and a shiver rose like a promise kept. When tiredness arrived, it wore holiness, and the bodies honored it. No scramble to prove anything, no fear that stopping would end the magic. Rest laid itself over the scene like a trusted blanket. Limbs tangled because tangling felt like punctuation, like the period at the end of a sentence that began across a café and took its time becoming a paragraph worth rereading. The air cooled. The radiator hissed its lullaby. The city outside remembered its responsibilities. Inside, a soft yes lingered, the kind that would still be there at breakfast. And there was breakfast in the mind now, coffee and toast and the unassuming glory of a morning where the first smile seen will be the one that slept only inches away. Before sleep fully claimed the room, there came one last exchange. Not grand and not small, a hand pressed lightly against the center of a chest, fingers spread as if to hold the heartbeat the way a palm might hold water, not gripping, not losing. Another hand covered it. Breaths matched. The future didn't need to be named. It only needed this moment to be tended well. Outside, a siren flared and faded. Inside, the last lamp clicked off. In the dark, there was nothing to distract from the truth that had taken root. The night didn't end. It settled. And in that settling, two hearts learned how light is found in skin and silence, how tenderness and surrender are not opposites but doorways that open the same home, and how one night held with care can change everything. Morning made a gentle entrance, a pale ribbon sliding across the floorboards, lifting color out of the dark like a patient hand turning the page after the most necessary chapter. The room felt rearranged even though nothing had moved. The same chair by the window, the same book on the nightstand, the same sweater slung over the back of a chair, and yet each object seemed to hum a little, as if charged by the truth of the night. Air smelled faintly of sleep and skin, and the hint of coffee already starting its small miracle in the kitchen. Even the quiet sounded clearer. There's a certain silence that comes after storms when branches are still and birds dare their first notes. That silence lived here now. Breathing found its pattern, a matched rhythm that needed no conductor, the metronome of two hearts choosing the same tempo. Eyes opened to find a shoulder within reach, the line of an arm resting like a vow made without fanfare. The face beside this face carried that softened look sleep gives to those who answered the dark with tenderness. A thought rose and hovered. Not a plan, not a promise, not a demand, just a recognition. Something new has begun, and it is not fragile because it is honest. Sheets held the warmth of admission. The body felt unarmored in a way that didn't threaten, only released. No rush to get up, no scramble to fix an image, no need to narrate what it meant. Meaning was present, sitting at the edge of the bed with its elbows on its knees, smiling. Fingers traced a quiet arc over a clavicle, not to wake but to remember. Memory is not always a museum of pain. Sometimes it is a greenhouse for small green beginnings. The night had been a series of yeses that made room for morning, and morning answered back with the kind of clarity that doesn't shout. Coffee clicked, water heated. The old kettle added its soft hiss to the day's overture. Feet found the floor. The room greeted with a little shiver that turned into a hum when skin met fabric, and fabric met sunlight. A mirror caught a glimpse and returned it without editing. Flushed cheeks, loose hair, a mouth that had learned a new way to rest, unclenched, almost smiling. The kitchen felt like a chapel built of small rituals. 2 mugs. A spoon tapping the rim to steady a hand that wasn't actually shaking. The simple beauty of filling one cup, then the other, and knowing which belongs where as if the counter itself remembered. The laugh that followed when the first sip came too hot, and the second sip returned as a sigh. The clink of ceramic set down just so. The quiet gratitude that swelled without request. Not a thunderous gratitude that tries to earn what it has. Only the kind that says thank you under its breath to no one in particular. Over breakfast, words moved with the lazy grace of Sunday rivers. No need to relive what had already been lived well. Better to ask the ordinary questions that build a bridge into the day. How do you take toast? Which fruit is worth the first bite? Is there time to walk before work, or should the walk be saved for night? Answers were themselves a kind of touch, gentle, specific, attentive. Laughter arrived unannounced, not the brittle kind that guards doorways, the full-bodied kind that shakes its mane and settles in. Hands met briefly over the table, then stayed longer than required to pass the jam. The world beyond the window kept its own schedule, buses sighing to curbs, cyclists tilting into light, a child tugging a sleeve toward some urgent and tiny mission. But inside there was a sanctity not protected by locks, only by presence. Presence is the least glamorous miracle and the most necessary. No one tried to own the moment. Both tended it. The conversation found small covenants, honesty even when it wobbles, slowness where speed once crashed, playfulness where shame once built fences. Under the table, ankles knocked and didn't apologize. Above it, eyes held when they could have looked away. The morning tasted like second chances without the heavy cost of penance. The past hadn't been erased. It had been welcomed to a different seat where it could witness but not direct. Scars, those beautiful signatures of survival, did not require makeup or concealment. They were understood as lines that led here. Later, the walk became a gentle rehearsal for the days ahead. Sidewalks remembered every footfall but seemed surprised to learn a new pair of shadows. Leaves made that papery sound that turns thoughts toward gratitude. A dog trotted past as if on official business. Fingers threaded without fanfare and discovered how easily they recognized one another. The city offered itself like a witness sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And the truth was this: tenderness can be steady, and steadiness can be tender. Storefront reflections showed 2 people without performance. Not curated, not staged, not trying to be anything but present enough to feel the breeze lift the hem of a coat and carry the scent of cinnamon from a bakery that would be visited later. Plans surfaced, small, sweet ones, the kind that don't dare the future but invite it. A movie with too many quiet scenes, which is to say a good one. A used bookstore that always smells like cedar and dust. Soup that requires time and therefore gives it. Maybe a plant for the windowsill that thrives in morning light. Maybe a picture frame that will wait patiently until something worthy slips behind its glass. Back home, the bed was made, not to pretend the night hadn't happened, but to bless it and keep it. Pillows fluffed like clouds taught to hold shape. The sweater moved from chair to hook because care, once awakened, tends to everything. An unexpected tenderness toward the ordinary rose like tidewater. Dishes washed with the concentration usually reserved for confessions. Towels folded as if every corner mattered. Love is not a trick of crescendos. It is the discipline of small attentions. Phone screens lit with obligations and neither flinched. Work did not become the enemy. It became the place where this new steadiness would prove itself. Goodbyes for the day were not rope pulls against a closing door. They were hinge-oiled, clean, a promise that knew its own weight and carried it easily. A kiss at the threshold gave morning its seal. Not dramatic, not distracted, centered. The elevator's mirror caught two expressions that matched without trying. The lobby smelled faintly of mail and lemon cleaner. The street offered a rush of buses, brakes, and a sky already brighter than expected. A text arrived before the corner was turned. Not a flood, not a performance, just a line that made the ribs widen with a breath that remembered last night and chose this morning. Later, alone with the workday, the awakening continued in quieter ways. The body wore a different posture, a dignity that didn't need to be defended. The mind resisted its old job as a museum of fear and embraced a new role as a garden of attention. Tasks came and went with the kind of focus that is easier after being held. The impulse to catastrophize softened. The pause between stimulus and response lengthened enough to invite wisdom to step in. Even difficult moments failed to reclaim the house. They knocked and were greeted at the porch, offered water, then gently asked to move along. Evening approached with the sense of a story returning for its second chapter, not to repeat, but to deepen. Keys found the bowl by the door. Shoes learned the taste of the hallway again. The room smelled like something simmering, a promise in a pot. Music took its place, low and sure. A coat sleeve brushed another coat sleeve and stayed. The day's edges were sanded down by small kindnesses. The hand that took the grocery bag without announcement. The hug that lasted past the first exhale. The silence that followed not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing to prove. The bed waited, but not as the site of verdicts. As a place of rest, bodies found each other with the ease that follows truth. Not identical to last night. Newness had gentled into knowing, but still lit with the spark that says yes, still here. Desire hummed again, but it was the soft hum of a well-tuned instrument, ready when the song called. There would be time for everything. For laughter that interrupts a kiss. For stillness that doesn't fear being misunderstood. For the quiet joy of existing inches away from a face that has become a compass. And if tomorrow asked harder questions, the answer would begin the same way this morning began, with presence, with coffee, with touch that speaks without taking. Love didn't revise history. It changed the meaning of here. It didn't seize, it stayed. It didn't demand, it offered. The awakening was not a trumpet. It was a door opening to a room where the light always knew how to arrive and was simply waiting to be invited in. And in that light, the day began again with the simplest, bravest truth of all. Choose to stay. If this story moved something inside you, don't let it fade. Keep the feeling alive. Hit like, subscribe, and share this journey with someone who still believes in love that heals, transforms, and stays. Because every heartbeat deserves to be heard, and every soul deserves a true love story.